Samuele. It is now 9:10 p.m. in the grimmest, darkest, most dismal state of that Budapest has been in quite some time, since for about a year, where you've kind of forgotten what the sun even looks like, what it means. Then you see the sun, and it's only going to get worse because it's really only on the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. So it's really, really, really grim. However, on a more uplifting note, thank you everybody who has joined me for the Gaggle live stream on Tuesday evening for me. Um, and there are a few things that we could talk about. The entirely predictable vote has taken place in the House of Representatives to release the Epstein files. I mean, everyone knew it. And then, of course, we had the news conference today, which is largely a fraud. I mean, it really is just a hoax. All of these claims, the victims, the survivors, supposedly of Epstein. These are women who had come into Epstein's orbit when they were in their 20s. I mean, so they come along and pretend that they're survivors. They came into his orbit when they were in their 20s. And everything that we have seen about Epstein is he was obviously quite a charismatic figure. He seemed to have drawn all sorts of very, very wealthy, powerful individuals into his orbit. I mean, he's hanging around with, Bill Gates. He's hanging around with Noam Chomsky. Obviously, Larry Summers. They all were cultivating his friendship. Now, these are all very smart people. They're not stupid people. So, a lot of people were drawn into his orbit. And, we do know that young women are drawn towards men with money and power, not necessarily because they find them especially attractive, but because they assume, rightly, that such men can do all sorts of things for them. And it's clear that Epstein did do a lot of things for these women. He paid for their uh, college fees and so on. And of course, when inevitably disappointment um, prevails, as indeed always happens, then there are the recriminations, and of course there are the accusations, are very unfair, often accusations. I mean, you don't have to like Epstein, you don't have to admire Epstein. He obviously is not a likable or admirable person, but these were young women, most all the young women above the age of consent, who were drawn into his orbit because they thought, hey, a rich, powerful guy who seems to know an awful lot of other rich, powerful guys is someone worth hanging out with because he could do things for my career. And he often did do things for these young women's careers. And and then to pretend that they are victims, pretend that they're survivors. This whole thing is survivor. I mean, using this ridiculous terminology that they are survivors. Then their dealings with Epstein were about 30 years ago, and so it's largely a hoax, something that plays well in the media, um, and I have to. Sorry, I mean, I'm distracted because Dale Owens, our good friend Dale Owens, who always has some interesting question that he poses, and again he hasn't failed. Dale says, George, what do you make of the claims that the KGB murdered Hugh Gateskill and Harold Wilson was a Soviet agent? This is a very interesting story because, of course, the Britain's MI5 had long suspected that Harold Wilson was a Soviet agent, and this was, of course, highlighted by Peter Wright's book. This was the book that Peter Wright, who was a senior figure within MI5, but who also believed that the head of MI5, Sir Roger Hollis, was also working for the KGB, and he spent years trying to nail Sir Roger Hollis and spectacularly failed to do so. And in fact, in his book, Spycatcher, he recounts a meeting with Hollis. And Hollis kind of turns to him and says, "You think I'm a Soviet agent, don't you?" And Wright, I suppose, says, "Yeah, I do." And he says, "Well, what can I do to persuade you that I'm not?" But of course, he couldn't. I mean, there was nothing he could do. I mean, Wright um, investigated Hollis for years and years and years, and never came up with any evidence that he was a Soviet agent. And then Wright's kind of man in the media, Chapman Pincher, wrote a whole book about the Roger Hollis case. I think it's called "Their Trade is Treachery." You know, nice alliteration. "Their trade is treachery," where he just regurgitated all of Wright's accusations against Roger Hollis. But there's really nothing there. I mean, it was just he didn't have any evidence of this. So now the case with Wilson was particularly interesting because Hugh Gateskill had been a kind of centrist figure in the Labour Party. He was a centrist leader of the Labour Party. He had led Labour in the 1955 election, which Labour lost, and then he led Labour in the 1959 election, which also Labour lost. And in 1963, he was still quite a young man. He died suddenly, in quite mysterious circumstances, and it was kind of inexplicable. And then his successor was Harold Wilson, and Wilson had been a figure on the left of the party. He was a kind of center left figure. His opponents for the party leadership in 1963 had been George Brown and James Callahan, both of whom were kind of associated with the right of the party. But in a way, that ensured Wilson's victory, because essentially the right wing vote was split between Brown and Callahan, and then so Wilson got in. And so, given the circumstances that, well, he's a figure on the left of the party, given that Gateskill died in somewhat mysterious circumstances, there was indeed a suspicion that somehow Wilson was working for the KGB. Now, and there was also some of the people around Wilson had kind of dodgy Soviet connections. They had business interests in the Soviet Union. Now, what I think became quite interesting in this case, so Peter Wright absolutely convinced that Wilson was a KGB agent, and began this again another long investigation of Harold Wilson, but that James Angleton, who was the head of counterintelligence at the CIA, he became convinced. I mean, James Angleton has kind of went a little off his rocker after the Kim Philby disclosure. I mean, Philby had been a good friend of his, and Philby had held exactly the same position as Angleton had. I mean, Philby was head of counterintelligence at MI6, which is kind of MI6 is the equivalent to the CIA. So he was head of counterintelligence at MI6, and they were good friends, But Philby was in Washington, and he and Angleton would hang out and enjoy dinners and gossip and the usual Washington stuff. So when it was disclosed that Philby was working for the Soviet Union, Angleton was in shock because he was afraid that he had obviously disclosed all kinds of information over boozy evenings with Philby. Information was obviously going to Moscow, and so from that moment on, Angleton became extraordinarily, obsessively suspicious of of everything, and that's why he was very prone to believe that Harold Wilson was indeed a KGB agent, and but he also believed Henry Kissinger was a Soviet agent. So it's not like it wasn't just simply limited to Wilson. So to answer the question, I don't see much evidence of this. Now, Wilson pursued a kind of a détente policy with the Soviet Union, but everyone did it at that time. So from 1964 through to 1976, with the exception of the 3.5 years of the Edward Heath conservative government. So during those time, Wilson pursued a détente policy with the Soviet Union, but so did Willy Brandt in Germany, so did de Gaulle in France, and so incidentally did both Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon in the United States. So everyone pursued a détente policy. The I mean, some kind of colonial, not people who were nostalgic for empire, were very unhappy that Wilson was liquidating the British military presence east of Suez. So you had the east, British still have maintained some bases east of Suez, and until Wilson just simply dissolved them. And of course, he made very little. A lot of these imperial outposts really made very little sense once Britain granted independence to India. I mean, these imperial outposts were there in order to safeguard the route to India. But once India was no longer in the empire, then you really didn't need all these imperial outposts. So Wilson kind of liquidated these, with the Wilson government, and people who didn't like that thought, oh well, he's obviously playing into the hands of the Soviet Union. Um, I mean, so I have to say I'm not buying the story, and I'm not buying the story because I think Peter Wright was a kind of ridiculous character. I mean, it's like as I say, he made these accusations against Roger Hollis. He never really remotely um, came close to demonstrating that Hollis was working for the Soviet. But the problem arose really from the whole Burgess McLean Philby episode, because it caught the British establishment, in shock. The British establishment was look, Burgess McLean, Philby had been members of the establishment, and of course they were working for the Kremlin. And then, of course, there was all the story about the speculation as to who tipped off Burgess and McLean. There was a third man. Obviously, people say, "Oh well, Philby has to be the third man," but I don't think Philby was the third man. So there was the search then for the third man, and then of course, um, later on, this was in 1979, soon after Thatcher became prime minister, it was disclosed that within this ring, this Cambridge spy ring, was the master of the Queen's Pictures. Oh God, what's his name now? I can see his face. The master of the Queen's Pictures. The Anthony Blunt. And then of course there was then it was and then there was John Cairncross, who was also part of that circle, so the Cambridge Five, which was Burgess, Philby, McLean, Blunt, and then John Cairncross, and so that well, hey, we now got this whole spy ring. but that was them. Wilson had nothing to do with any of that. I mean, this was really the strange group of people. These the Cambridge Five, um, who came from good families, and you know decided, oh, I'm gonna go. I'm studying, Marxism. I think Anthony Blunt said something like, I was converted to the Marxist interpretation of history by Guy Burgess. I mean, I remember when he said that, and it was such a ridiculous thing. You were converted, to this, awful alcoholic, pufter Guy Burgess. He converted you to the Marxist interpretation of history. So it was kind of ridiculous. But the one amusing aspect, you see, when it was revealed, because Thatcher just basically disclosed this. Blunt was alive at the time, and he was still master of the Queen's pictures. Um, and so he resigned as the master of the Queen's pictures after Thatcher's disclosure about Blunt. And then, Blunt, he's an eminent academic, art historian. He was a he was he was a member of the British Academy, which is what you become a member of the British Academy in if you have a distinguished academic record, which Anthony Blunt did. And but the British Academy, upon learning of this disclosure that he was working for the Soviets, basically expelled him from the British Academy. Well, we can't have him as a member of the British Academy. And then A.J.P. Taylor, who also was a fellow of the British Academy, promptly issued his resignation. I resign from the British Academy because this is absolutely outrageous that Anthony Blunt should be expelled from the British Academy. Anthony Blunt is a distinguished scholar and historian, and nothing that's been disclosed about any of his Soviet connection has anything to do with his scholarship and his academic credentials. It is an absolute disgrace for the British Academy to expel Anthony Blunt. And I mean, it's a principled stance, but it was just hilarious because it's so typical of A.J.P. Taylor that he would have taken this stance. Anyway, to conclude, I haven't seen any evidence about Wilson. Now, it is true that Wilson's resignation in 1976 has always been a mystery. I mean, he'd been prime minister from 64 to 70, and he obviously lost a few steps between 1970 and 1974. He wasn't quite as fiery and as quick on his feet and as clever and amusing as he used to be. And he wasn't expecting to win the February 1974 election. If you recall, that was the one Edward Heath just called that rather suddenly. Wilson thought he was going to lose, but to Wilson's astonishment, he won. I mean, in the sense that he didn't get an absolute majority, but Labour was the largest party in Parliament. He became prime minister in February 74. Wilson wasn't expecting this, and so it was a kind of a present that he wasn't looking for. Wasn't really that enthusiastic about becoming prime minister again. So, and then there was another election that same year, October 74, which Wilson won. They did get an absolute majority, a very small majority, but nonetheless a majority. And then in 76, Wilson suddenly resigned for quite inexplicably. It was no one exactly knew what had triggered this. And so there was a lot of speculation that maybe the Soviets had applied pressure on him, but there was also the speculation and there's some justification that he was coming under a lot of pressure from MI5, Peter Wright in particular, and from the Americans, from the CIA. And there were these constant allegations against him, and he just got really fed up with it. And so he stepped aside. 1976, he just stepped aside, never really explained why he resigned. But he was tired. I mean, you could see, I remember the news conferences he gave, well, not news conference. In those days, you gave interviews. The interviews he gave, he seemed quite old and become old and tired. He was also drinking a lot um, during those 2 years of his presidency. He started knocking the bottle back. But that again led to this all the speculation. Well, if he had come under a lot of pressure from MI5 and from the CIA, what was it that they had on him? Was it that they were going to just disclose his KGB connection? But I haven't seen any, and that's why I'd have to say I don't think he was a Soviet agent. I mean, it's a nice idea, and it captures the spirit of the time when people they had because of the whole Burgess McLean case that people became quite obsessed about who was a Soviet agent. Just about everybody was suspected of being a Soviet agent. So Wilson was naturally would fit the bill as having in the Labour Party. He was had been on the left of the Labour Party and so on. But I don't really. Um, so Mikey Muller says close colleagues of Wilson have said that Wilson told them that he intended to resign at 60. Wilson, he said things like that, and but I remember during the interviews that he gave when he announced his resignation that he never really intended to stay on for more than 2 years and so on. So I think he said things like that. He probably was concerned about the growing the growing influence on the Labour Party of the left. And the left was quite powerful within the Labour Party in those days, particularly through the weight of the trade unions. And Wilson may well have then thought that by resigning at that stage, he would ensure that Labour would still be under the rule of a figure from the Labour right, which is what happened when he resigned. I mean, everyone knew that his successor would be James Callaghan, and so basically the kind of the centrist wing of the party would prevail. But I think he was concerned. I mean, the left was becoming ever more dominant within the Labour Party. As somebody says, a number one pipe man. The pipe thing with Wilson was always very dubious because he did that for public consumption. In those days, people used to smoke pipes. I mean, that pipes have now kind of gone out completely, but smoking a pipe used to be quite a working class thing to do. People in the working class, they'd wear a cloth cap and they'd be smoking a pipe. You'd go to the pub and you'd smoke a pipe. And Wilson did that in public. He would smoke a pipe, but in private he smoked cigars. He never smoked a pipe in private. He smoked cigars. But he wanted to maintain his own kind of working class credentials, where he'd be smoking pipes. Yes, exactly. Smoked cigars. He was a cigar person. But those days, you go with a pipe, and he's a friend of the working man. He's a working class lad. Anyway, that was a bit of a distraction. Dale Owen says he ended up standing in for Michael Parkinson. Terrible interviewer. I have to say I never saw that. So that I must have missed that. I didn't know that he'd be standing in for Michael Parkinson. No, he, yeah. I mean, he's not an interviewer, obviously. He was he was very, very quick on his feet. I mean, that was his specialty. He was quick on his feet. He was very amusing. I never really come across a sort of a political figure who was successful, who was as witty as he was and as quick on his feet as he was. I mean, when he used to do those in the parliament, when he do this parliamentary question time, and he was really good at put downs, and you knew exactly. I mean, particularly with Edward Heath. Heath was a very wooden person, and Wilson just loved putting down Edward Heath. So it says well, British politics, as somebody said, lack charisma, but British politics doesn't really thrive on charisma, and it's a parliamentary system, so you don't really, it's not like you're really out in the crowds and you're trying to stir up excitement among the crowds. I mean, you're basically a prime minister. He has to control his parliamentary party. He has to control his cabinet. But it's a party political system. Every election, leader, party, manifesto. So it's never really the individual who kind of has to present his case before the voters. So, you had Churchill. Obviously, was a special case. You could say he was a charismatic, but hard to think of any political figure who was charismatic. Thatcher was more of a divisive figure. She had followers, but and obviously people who hated Thatcher. But she was not a charismatic person. But she had people enthusiasm, but she also riled people up. But certainly not a charismatic person. So now, speaking of charisma, is that we had Mohammed bin Salman. I'm not saying Mohammed bin Salman is charismatic, but he was in the Oval Office today with Trump, and there was a reporter from ABC who did the usual thing that reporters do these days, which is to not really ask a question, but do a sort of "when did you stop beating your wife" type statement come question. I mean, you're not asking, what do you think of this or what do you think of that? It's like, hey, I'm going to accuse you of all sorts of things, and now please respond to my accusation. So let's just take a look at what happened when this ABC reporter confronted Trump and Mohammed bin Salman.
Is it appropriate, Mr. President, for your family to be doing business in Saudi Arabia while you're president? Is that a conflict of interest? And Your Royal Highness, the U.S. intelligence concluded that you orchestrated the brutal murder of a journalist. 9/11 families are furious that you are here in the Oval Office. Why should Americans trust you? And the same to you, Mr. President.
Now, who are you with?
I'm with ABC News, sir.
You with who?
ABC News, sir.
Fake news. ABC fake news. One of the worst in the business. But I'll answer your question. I have nothing to do with the family business. I have left, and when I've devoted 100% of my energy. What my family does is fine. They do business all over. They've done very little with Saudi Arabia, actually. I'm sure they could do a lot. And anything they've done has been very good. That's what we've done. We've built a tremendous business for a long time. I've been very successful. I decided to leave that success behind and make America very successful. And I've made America more successful by far than it ever was, and that it ever could have been, no matter who was president. There would be nobody bringing in $21 trillion, that I can tell you right now. As far as this gentleman is concerned, he's done a phenomenal job. You're mentioning somebody that was extremely controversial. A lot of people didn't like that gentleman that you're talking about. Whether you like him or didn't like him, things happen. But he knew nothing about it, and we can leave it at that. You don't have to embarrass our guest by asking a question like that.
Just yes, Mr. President, you allow me to answer. I feel painful about families of 9/11 in America, but we have to focus on reality. Reality based on CIA documents and based on a lot of documents that Osama bin Laden used Saudi people in that event for one main purpose, is to destroy this relation, to destroy the American-Saudi relation. That's the purpose of 9/11. So whoever buying that means they are helping Osama bin Laden's purpose of destroying this relation. He knows that strong relation between America and Saudi Arabia, it's bad for extremism, it's bad for terrorism. And we have to prove him wrong and to build our relation, continue developing our relation. It's critical in the safety of the world. It's critical against extremism and terrorism. About the terrorists, it's really painful to hear, anyone that been losing his life for, no real purpose or not in a legal way. And it's been painful for us in Saudi Arabia. We've did all the right steps of investigation, etc., in Saudi Arabia, and we've improved our system to be sure that nothing happened like that. And it's painful and it's a huge mistake, and we are doing our best that this doesn't happen again.
All right. So now, obviously, all the journalists now rush to the aid of this ABC reporter. I'm just laughing because Marty has posted. He always posts some interesting memes. So this is the picture. Everyone should enjoy this picture. This is a picture of Alexander Stubb, the Finnish non-entity who is the president of Finland, who apparently is a very good golfer. I mean, he spent time in the United States on a golf scholarship. It's amazing that you can get these golf scholarships. But yeah, apparently, you get golf scholarships or tennis scholarships. So he got a golf scholarship, and apparently, he's bonded with Trump over golf, and he is one of the most belligerent, bloodthirsty, war hawkish creatures in NATO. He, along with the rest of the Baltic Chihuahuas, Poland, and everything. They're ones who always want to think that it's always inadequate. Whatever you're doing against Russia, it's never enough. You got to get more, because that's the way to get Putin to the negotiating table. But they just people who have just an obsessive hatred of Russia. So that's Stubb, Alexander Stubb. I just like saying that. But anyway, the thing is that everyone leapt to the aid of this ABC reporter. I don't think she deserves any question. Did you hear a question there? What was the question? She just threw out a lot of accusations. What happens when you throw out a lot of accusations? I mean, so somebody says golf scholarships for the underprivileged. Yeah, exactly. It's very underprivileged. Only poor people apply for golf scholarships. Exactly. There isn't a question there. I mean, the whole point of it is to embarrass the person that you're addressing, and then you get celebrated by your colleagues at ABC or New York Times or whatever. They're, you socked it to the man. You really talk truth to power. You really did something fantastic, but it doesn't get anywhere. What do you expect Trump to say when you tell him that there's some kind of a conflict of interest over your family's business interests in the Persian Gulf? Everyone knows about his, they know about his family's business. He himself has kind of stepped aside from his family business, but since time immemorial, the United States has had wealthy people who have been presidents, and there's always a possible conflict of interest. I mean, it's not, you can have the professional politician, but of course, as we've seen in the case of Joe Biden and with other presidents like Lyndon Johnson, who start off poor but suddenly become fantastically rich through a political career. I mean, at least in the case of Trump and others, they were already men of means. They were already wealthy before they became president. So you can't say, well, I use my time in office to get rich. But Lyndon Johnson was very poor. When he came from a very poor family, but retired, a fantastically rich man. Um, and same with Biden. Biden was, he spent his whole life in politics. He didn't have any money. Basically, he was elected senator when he was 29. By the time he leaves, he's a very, very rich man. How does that go? So essentially, he's used his office to get rich, which I think is far more objectionable than somebody who already has money and doesn't really need money, doesn't need any additional money, and whatever with a conflict of interest. But I also don't see the conflict of interest. I mean, the United States, its policy towards Saudi Arabia has been nothing if not consistent. I mean, you don't have to like that policy. I don't think there's nothing. He said, yeah, Joe Biden was the poorest member of the Senate at one time. Yeah, it was a very odd. It was. There was a way that he counted what he had, which was really quite dishonest. Um, the the thing is, someone says, well, I think it's questionable Trump's son's doing business deal with some Arab countries that are courting Trump's favor. But the money isn't really the important part of it. I mean, the United States' policy towards Saudi Arabia is absolutely consistent. I mean, there's just no, there's ever since FDR and his relations with Ibn Saud has been absolute. There's been no change at all. Whoever's president, it was Biden who kind of foolishly got himself into a mess with the Saudis by bringing up the Khashoggi thing, which was an internal Saudi matter, and therefore quite pointless for him to do. But generally, that's what they do now. The Trump's family business, yeah, they're making money, but Trump himself isn't making money. I mean, the family isn't making money, but that would be happening anyway. I mean, it's not as a result of anything that Trump is doing. That would be happening anyway. Trump's family makes money in the Persian Gulf. I mean, it has been making money for a long time. It's not because of what Trump is doing as president. They want Trump investments in the Persian Gulf. But that the point about this report, and then she went on about the case of Khashoggi, and MBS didn't exactly answer that part of the question terribly convincingly. Trump answered it more convincingly. He said, "Oh, well, he knew nothing about it," and so on. But how does Trump know that he knew nothing about it? But in any case, the problem is that it really doesn't. It has nothing to do with the United States. Ultimately, it had nothing to do with the United States. It's like, the president of the United States is the president of the United States. His powers are described in some detail in the Constitution. We have the Federalist Papers, who also, the founding fathers, they describe the powers and responsibilities of the president. But nowhere does it say that among the powers and responsibilities of the president is intruding in every country's internal affairs, however much you may not like it. And then, I mean, Saudi Arabia is not a particularly nice place, but a lot of countries are not particularly nice places, and that just isn't. It's not the responsibility of a U.S. president to start intruding into internal affairs. I mean, at least there, Trump is acting in the spirit of America First, which is America First means I'm only concerned with American interests, and not with the interests of any other country. So they're, yeah, I don't interfere. And there was never any reason for this emotional response to Khashoggi. I mean, Khashoggi was not an American citizen. I mean, if you were an American citizen, that would be a different issue. And Khashoggi was not a green card holder, which even then, it's questionable whether he's just a resident alien. So he didn't even have that status. He was a columnist for the Washington Post, but okay, so he's a columnist for the Washington Post. That doesn't mean an American president has to get very distraught about what happened to him. But she just rushed this thing out, and in this kind of non-question question, and of course, everyone, all her colleagues, oh, fantastic, you really socked it to him. Totally pointless, absolutely waste of time. I mean, you don't get anywhere like that. And I always said that when you get journalists, when in the days when Putin used to give interviews to Western journalists. I mean, he hasn't given one, I think, since Tucker Carlson. But he used, I mean, he would have, he would give an interview to Megyn Kelly. He would give an interview to Chris Wallace, and the guy at NBC. I forgot his name. Anyway, and they would all do the same thing, which is, well, it's been said that you interfered in the U.S. election. Why did you interfere in the U.S. election? I mean, you're not going to get anywhere, and it's a total waste of time. I mean, if you've got an hour, let's say you've got an hour with a Russian president, you want to use your hour as usefully as possible. You want to use that hour to get as much out of a Russian president as you can. Same with you're in the Oval Office. You've got one question, so you want to just think about, well, how can I ask a question that will elicit important information, rather than it'll just annoy Trump, and then Trump will tell me to shut up and that he's not going to call on me anymore. I mean, that's it. So you what have you achieved? You haven't really achieved anything. But except wasted time. But you got the clicks, and the people talking about it, and all your colleagues are saying, "Whoa, you did really great. That was really you did something. She didn't do anything great. All she did was she just annoyed Trump. Like, I mean, that's not quite what journalism is supposed to be. Just annoying someone for the sake of it. Anyway, the other thing that I wanted to mention, and we talked about it on the live stream with Peter yesterday. Is the case in Poland. So there was an explosion apparently on a railway track on Sunday, and Poland say, "Well, this is this is a terrorist act, the worst terrorist act ever." Even though no one was hurt, but there's a worst act ever, and there were already suspicions. Yesterday already there were suspicions that Russia was involved, and then today, Prime Minister Donald Tusk declared no more suspicions. He flatly said Russia. It was Russia that was behind this explosion on the railway track. And so here is the tweet that Tusk sent out, and he says that as a result of the investigation, we now know it was the Russian secret services that commissioned the blast of the Polish railway and recruited 2 Ukrainians to do it. We also know the identities of the perpetrators, who immediately fled Poland for Belarus. So right away, you puzzled, that you know who the perpetrators are, even though they fled immediately to Belarus. So in other words, you haven't talked to them, you haven't uh, arrested them. There's been no police interview. And then you also say that the that they were Ukrainians. So they're Ukrainians, but they're working for the Russians. Okay. But it's already strange. So the Russian secret services are involved, even though these guys are in Belarus. They managed to escape to Belarus right away, according to Tusk. Now, the thing to remember about Tusk is that Tusk is a shameless liar. You remember when he claimed that a Polish house had been destroyed by Russian drones? Russia, house, Poland, all these houses have been destroyed. Russian drones destroyed it, and then eventually it came out that it was a Polish missile that had destroyed that house. It wasn't a drone; it was a Polish missile. The other thing, of course, is that this railway line is, according to Tusk himself, is being used to send arms to Ukraine. That would make it a legitimate military target. I mean, there's a legitimate. You're using this in order to transfer weapons to Ukraine, weapons that will be used to kill Russians. So, that's by any such stretch of the imagination is a legitimate military target. But remember Tusk's logic, the logic espoused by Tusk and his revolting foreign minister, Radek Sikorski, that any piece of infrastructure anywhere in the world that helps the Russian war effort is a legitimate target for terrorism. So therefore, a refinery in Hungary that refines Russian oil is a legitimate target. The Nord Stream was a legitimate target. That's why Tusk said, no, we're not going to hand over these suspects to Germany. Now, remember also, there's another thing about how did Tusk know already that the Russians were behind this, even though how many months did we have to wait? And we still don't know about Nord Stream. I mean, the Nord Stream was blown up now 3 years ago. 3 years ago, and we still don't know who we have a suspect here, a suspect there. We don't know, who actually were the perpetrators. Here, within 24 hours, they already know who did it. But anyway, so he's thrown out this accusation, and of course, the media, the same media that hey, we stocked it to the man to Trump. They're of course all are ready to repeat these stories. So this is TVP, Polish television. It says Ukrainians collaborating with Russia behind railway sabotage, says Polish PM. 2 people accused of sabotaging railway line in Poland are Ukrainians who collaborated with Russian intelligence and then fled to Belarus. And then Tusk added that the suspects had long been operating with Russian intelligence and that one had been convicted by a court in the Ukrainian city of Lvov in May this year for sabotage. So one has been convicted, but why was he in Poland? And then it says the second suspect is from the Russian-occupied Donbass region, whom Tusk said crossed from Belarus into Poland together with the first suspect this fall. Okay, so they got into the country, even though one of them had been convicted. So as a criminal, he'd been convicted. So it's not clear. Did they enter the country illegally? I mean, why would somebody enter the country if he's already been convicted of let's see, what was he convicted of? He said he had been convicted by a court in the Ukrainian city of Lvov for sabotage. So he was convicted, and yet he managed to enter the country. All right. Two sections of the Warsaw to Lublin line considers a strategic link between Poland's capital and the eastern regions bordering Ukraine were targeted by covert operations over the weekend. Speaking in Parliament on Tuesday, Tusk repeated his assertion that the perpetrators were seeking to cause a disaster on the rails. We are dealing with an unprecedented event. This is perhaps the most serious situation in the context of Poland's security since the outbreak of the full-scale war in Ukraine. And then says Tusk said he would ask the foreign ministry to take action to try to bring the suspects in this week's incidents back to Poland to face justice. How does he plan to bring them to Poland? Who's going to extradite these suspects? I mean, if they're in Belarus, I mean, it's very unlikely Belarus is going to extradite anybody. And if they're in Russia, even less likely that they're going to extradite anyone to Poland. And the starkness of the contrast between his insouciance towards the German demand that Poland extradite a Ukrainian suspect in the Nord Stream bombing. And he said, no, we're not extraditing anyone. Good. I'm glad that, they blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. But suddenly, he's going to demand the suspect be handed over to Poland. The Russian authorities care not only about the direct effect of such actions, but also about the social and political consequences. That is, disorganization, chaos, panic, speculation, uncertainty. Now, if that's the case, if that's those are the Russian goals, then why are you playing into that by getting hysterical? I mean, this spreading hysteria. But of course, that's exactly what the game is here in Europe, by whipping up this constant hysteria, absolute unmitigated hysteria about Russia. And already yesterday, we had Ursula von der Leyen says, the situation in Europe is getting more and more dangerous. Europe is under threat. He said this is the most serious since the full-scale war in Ukraine. Well, if it's so dangerous, why are you getting yourself involved in this war? If you get involved in a war, you're going to get hit. I mean, that's the way it works. If you get into a fight, then the chances are you're going to get hurt. I mean, if you don't want to get hurt, then don't get yourself into a fight. So the complete lack of any logic, complete lack of understanding of a relationship between cause and effect is quite striking. But of course, unless the goal is to whip up this hysteria in Europe, to generate absolute fear, panic throughout Europe that we are under attack. So I mean, we had the hysteria over the drones. Remember that was 2-3 weeks ago. Everyone was very excited about the drones. Apparently, everybody was under attack by the drones, even though no one was able to prove anything that there really were drone attacks, because these drones kind of appeared and then disappeared. But they said, oh, it was definitely the Russians. And so the way these things work is you first say, oh, we have suspicions that the Russians are involved. We just suspect, it's a drone attack. Hey, it's the Russians. And then once you've said that, the next step is to say, oh yeah, it was the Russians. And that there's a kind of seamless transition from saying, well, the suspicions abound. It's always in the passive voice. Suspicions abound that the Russians were behind this, to the point where you say, yeah, the Russians were behind it. So today, the Washington Post has a big story about some Russian guy in Azerbaijan who is wanted. He's wanted by the authorities, the security services, the legal authorities in Europe, because he was involved in some kind of it's never clear what exactly. Some explosions. There were apparently explosions. You remember we had the hysteria about these explosions taking place in warehouses. You had packages exploding. Now, I kind of assumed that these explosions are caused by, there's a lot of ammunition, weaponry being sent from one country after another. There's so many arms that are just pouring into Ukraine, that a lot of arms that I think are just finding their way onto the black market. And of course, if they're finding their way into the black market, then they're going to be, posted from one place to another. And along the way, some of them are going to explode. I mean, that's what happens with arms. But no, it was apparently the Russians. It's never explained what is the point of this. What's the point of having a package that explodes? I mean, how if the Russians are doing this, how does this help Russia's cause to have a package explode in a warehouse? I mean, it's not like, oh, they sent a package to 10 Downing Street and it exploded in 10 Downing Street. I mean, I don't even see what the point of that is. But I mean, a package exploding in a warehouse, I have to think. I mean, what is the point of this? But anyway, here is this story in the Washington Post, and you can see this the headline: Russia, Europe fight for custody of operative linked to DHL bomb plot. A Russian national now in Azerbaijan. So right away you think, well, why is a Russian national in Azerbaijan? Thinking, well, why wouldn't a Russian national? I mean, if the authorities are after him, wouldn't it make sense for him to be in Russia? I mean, you don't want to be stuck in Azerbaijan. So anyway, a Russian national now in Azerbaijan is suspected of coordinating a 2024 parcel plot targeting air cargo planes in Europe. So they're saying they're targeting air cargo planes. How do we know about this? Not one air cargo plane has been damaged. There's not been any explosion aboard an air cargo plane. Russia's spy agencies and Western security services are engaged in a secret struggle. It's secret, but the Washington Post knows all about it. It's a secret struggle to gain custody of a Russian operative suspected of coordinating attacks last year that caused air cargo packages to burst into flames in Europe. So air cargo packages burst into flames. And it had to be the Russians behind this, not, hey, you're sending ammunition in a very unsafe way and they could have just, exploded. No, this is all Russian plot. According to security officials and investigators from 5 Western countries. So that's your source. Your source is security officials and investigators from 5 Western countries. Don't tell me who the 5 Western countries are. Leave it as a surprise for me. And then he says, at the center of this tug of war is Yaroslav Mikhailov, a Russian national who is suspected of helping to design the incendiary devices used in the plot, directing the operation from within Europe, and using a fake passport to flee to Azerbaijan. So then they say, well, why does he need a fake passport to go to Azerbaijan? If he's a Russian national, he presumably has a Russian passport, and he can go to Russia. There he'll be safe. But you need a fake passport. You go to Azerbaijan, where you're not even safe. I mean, why would anyone think he's safe in Azerbaijan? In a measure of his importance to the Kremlin, his importance to the Kremlin, Western security officials said the heads of all three Russian intelligence services, FSB, SVR, and GRU, have been directly involved in pressuring Azerbaijan to return Mikhailov to Russia rather than grant an extradition request from Poland. But you still ask, well, why is a Russian national in Azerbaijan? Why isn't he in Russia? In turn, Poland, the United Kingdom, Ukraine, and Lithuania have lobbied the government in Baku in an effort to prevent his return to Russia. All right? And then this article is based on interviews with more than 24 Western security officials. Well, that's obviously a reliable source. I always, when I talk to 24 Western security officials, I know about a Russian, I know I'm going to get the straight dope. Among them is a secret Interpol application submitted by Poland seeking Mikhailov's arrest for terrorist operations. So, all right. In the air cargo operation in July last year, packages rigged with timers and a flammable magnesium compound escaped detection in Lithuania and were delivered to depots in Germany, Poland, and England, where they caused fires that spread quickly before being extinguished. Well, they couldn't have been very serious fires, since they were extinguished pretty easily. And then we have Mikhailov represents a new breed of Russian operative recruited by the GRU from criminal organizations for their contacts and capabilities, said a senior European security official. Mikhailov previously faced criminal charges in Russia for smuggling. All right, so he's a criminal and he's wanted by Russia because he's a criminal. He's faced criminal charges in Russia for smuggling. All right. Attempts to contact him were unsuccessful. A woman who acknowledged that she's Mikhailov's sister refused to answer questions after answering a call from a Post reporter. But it doesn't say anything like, is he under arrest in Azerbaijan, or what's his status? And then, but he's wanted apparently by the Russians. The attacks caused no injuries, but led to fires at depots in Leipzig, Warsaw, and Birmingham. Officials in Berlin said the time-set devices were powerful enough to cause a plane to plunge from the sky had they detonated during flight, but they didn't. There were also indications that Russia was planning to target the United States and Canada with similar package. There were indications. I love indications. U.S. officials, including then CIA Director William Burns, last year confronted counterparts in Moscow after intelligence indicated that the fires in Europe had been a test run for using similar devices on transatlantic cargo shipments, according to current and former U.S. officials. So we don't know anything about whether this confrontation ever took place. Just said, Burns confronted his counterparts in Moscow after intelligence indicated that fires in Europe had been a test run. Okay. Then we have experts said Russia's desires to gain custody of Mikhailov and prevent damaging disclosures that might accompany a trial in Europe were likely factors in Putin's recent efforts to mend ties with Baku. This is so idiotic. There are 110 reasons why Russia would want to mend ties with Baku. Armenia, Azerbaijan, the Caucasus, that's Russia's backyard. Russia's diminishing influence in its own backyard is, it's a serious drawback for Russia. The last thing Russia would want is for Armenia and Azerbaijan to fall under the American NATO umbrella. I mean, it's likely to happen, but you could see why Russia would want to avoid that and would want to mend ties with Baku. Oh, no, no, no. What it's about is that they need to gain custody of Mikhailov. Why do they need to gain custody of Mikhailov, who's obviously just a petty criminal? He's charged with smuggling in Russia and sending DHL packages. This is apparently a high priority for Russia. DHL packages exploding in Leipzig. Now, I'm reading out a story from the Washington Post. It's a front page story in the Washington Post today. Big, special investigation. And you got this nonsense. Oh, well, obviously Russia wants to improve relations with Baku because he wants to get his hands on Mikhailov. Why does he want to get his hands on Mikhailov? Because he could spill the beans. He could tell, really, really important things to the investigators. Russia has submitted its own extradition request, officials said, describing Mikhailov as a wanted criminal. Okay, a ploy. That is a ploy that Moscow has used in other cases to seek custody of operatives. You have no idea, absolutely no idea, that he's an operative. I mean, they're saying he's a Russian operative. They've already assumed that. They assumed that before going further. Oh, he's an operative for Russia. Then they say, oh, well, obviously the reason Russia wants to extradite him is not because he's wanted for some crimes in Russia, but because he's an operative. They want he's an operative. So you've already made your assumption, and then you start making deductions from your assumption. So Richard Phillips says it's not hysteria, it's propaganda. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It is propaganda. But the goal of this propaganda is to whip up hysteria, because it's day and night with these stories about, Russians are everywhere. They're just ubiquitous. Everything, anything that goes wrong anywhere, and Russia's behind it. And you frighten the population. You get them to panic, and then the next step, you're ready to go to war, because you've just so petrified everybody that, well, what can we do? Russia's out to destroy us. And then the push for custody of Mikhailov comes amid signs that Moscow's campaign of hybrid attacks, so this has now become accepted journalistic jargon, the hybrid attacks. No one exactly knows what's a hybrid attack, but it sounds good. Hybrid war that Russia is waging. Hybrid attacks in Europe may be surging again after a lull that followed Donald Trump's return to the White House. So it's surging. Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and other countries have in recent weeks been forced to ground flights after incursions into restricted airspace by drones that officials said were probably operated by a state adversary. They haven't proven anything. They allege this. This is a complete crock. We've done a couple of podcasts on this and said they haven't established anything. These are drones that kind of came from somewhere, then vanished, and then some government official said, well, I think Russia was behind this. And then it gets repeated and said, oh, Russia's lobbying these drones against us. And for what reason? What is the point? What to send drones over Denmark and Norway? If you want to spy on Denmark and Norway, you already have satellites up in the air. The satellites can provide you with all the information you need if you really want to spy on what's going on in Norway and Denmark. So what do you need the drones for? But and then they say, overall, the materials provide a blueprint to how Russia has tapped criminal networks to reconstitute capabilities that were degraded when European governments expelled hundreds of suspected Russian intelligence officers after a full-scale invasion of Ukraine began. But it's very unclear. Did this guy spend any time in Europe? They say, "Oh, he's really the mastermind behind this," but it's not clear. Did this person, where was he planning all of this? Because it's left very murky that, oh well, he somehow escaped to Azerbaijan. Escaped from where? Where was he located? Mikhailov occupied an important layer in the GIU's proxy network, officials said, taking orders from handlers in Russia and relaying instructions through telegram to a constellation of subordinates. How do they know all of this? I mean, none of them have spoken to him. It's extraordinary that they're making all these assertions about somebody who has never been in any kind of custody in the West. Many were young males with criminal records, willing to perform tasks for modest cryptocurrency payments. And then details of the operation and Mihailov's involvement were reported by a consortium of European news organizations earlier this year. Oh, I love a consortium of European news organizations sitting there, mouth agape, taking down, like good stenographers, this nonsense that's being peddled by the Western security services, consortium of European news organizations, believing every kind of nonsense that's being peddled to them. Mihailov's involvement. But this is a classic. Russia has mounted dozens of attacks across Europe using this outsourcing model, okay, including arson attacks on shopping centers in Poland and Lithuania. Again, how the hell do they? We have these supposed explosions in shopping centers at night, where it could be anything like basically power outage or faulty wiring, which incidentally happens all the time everywhere. You got bad wiring and it just does an explosion. But anyway, and then he says, as well as a London home owned by British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Well, that's very interesting, because that has never been established, that those male models who are in custody and are supposed to facing trial for these explosions at Keir Starmer's homes and Keir Starmer's former homes and Keir Starmer's former car. It's never been said that this had anything to do with Russia. I mean, there were Ukrainian male models, and then they said, "Oh well, it's Russia was behind this." These are the Washington Post. Even though there's been the UK, has not made that, has not gone into print, making the claim that this a London home owned by British Prime Minister Keir Starmer had been attacked by the Russians. Now, but even think about the absurdity of this. I mean, what would be the point of attacking a former home owned by Keir Starmer? Keir Starmer doesn't live there. It didn't do very much damage. In fact, it did no damage. Why would, I mean, what there seems to be no reason whatsoever for this, and they never present a reason. They just say, "Oh, it was the Russians who were behind this." But this is the level of this really ridiculous discourse. But as I say, since this happens every day, it does achieve it. There is a critical mass that you achieve, because people get say, well, God, the Russians are really ready to do anything. Anyway, let's look at the Gaggle locals board page. These are our friends, the Gagglers, who make sure that the dogs are in a reasonable mood they very rarely are in a reasonable mood. They're often quite mean and nasty. But it's very nice of the Gagglers, you know, try to keep them as happy as they can possibly be. So anyway, the first question, thank you very much, Stone River, really appreciate it. So Stone River asks, George, the thing that struck me most about the Tucker Carlson Nick Fuentes interview was that they both seem to have roughly the same deeply religious beliefs, and these beliefs seem to heavily shape their politics and worldview. What say you? Well, that's an interesting. That it didn't strike me that. I mean, that's not my that wasn't my impression. Now, Tucker Carlson has become um, quite religious in recent years. I don't think he was, or at least it wasn't part of his worldview during the years that he was at CNN and at MSNBC. But it does seem to inform his worldview now. I didn't get the sense, to be honest, maybe I missed this, that not Carlos Fuentes, Nick Fuentes, um, was um, was that religiously inspired. Maybe I just missed that. So I didn't really quite get the sense of that. Um, but I think Tucker Carlson is now very much his Christianity is it definitely informs his outlook, and I think it's very genuine with him. I mean, I think he really takes it very seriously. It's not for show, and I think it really is key, I think, to his outlook. As I say, I didn't get the sense of that from Fuentes. I mean, I'll take another look, um, and maybe see if I can spot that. Um, but just in terms of Tucker Carlson, I think that I do think that he is putting himself into a position. We talked about this with Peter the other day. He is putting himself into a position of being the inheritor of the mantle of America First, non-interventionism, because I think the struggle for the post-Trump GOP has already begun, and as things stand, I think Vance and Marco Rubio may be compromised by not having pursued America First in the way that they were expected to, because Trump himself hasn't. So they've been there in a way compromised by Trump moving in a direction that he had vowed that he would not move to. So that would open things up for Tucker Carlson. I actually do think that he will be a player for 2028, and therefore the religious aspect of his thinking will be quite interesting, um, because the there hasn't really been anyone among Republicans, or in fact, really any trying to think any recent presidential candidate who has taken religion particularly seriously. I mean, they of course they all piously say, yes, of course, I'm a Christian and I go to church and everything else, but none of them are really taking it seriously. There are presidents who used religion um, to win brownie points and to win votes. I mean, JFK, I think, clearly uses Catholicism to shame Americans into voting for a Catholic, even though they didn't want to. But hey, if you're against JFK, that means you're a Protestant bigot. So Kennedy used that very skillfully. But most um, presidents have really put religion on the back burner. So that would be quite interesting, because I think, if Tucker were to run, he would absolutely bring up his Christianity front and center. So that would make it quite interesting. But I'll take a look about the Fuentes. Anyway, thank you so much for your question, Stone River. Um, and then I missed this part of what Dale. This was a follow up to what we were discussing earlier. Then there is the claim that Lord Mountbatten considered overthrowing Wilson in 1968. That was a very strange episode. That it wasn't Lord Mountbatten himself who was planning all of this. It was Cecil King, who was this big publisher, really big shot publisher, and the Daily Mirror was one of his newspapers. But anyway, in 1968, Cecil King was supposedly started convening these meetings with everybody who was important in Great Britain to oust Harold Wilson and to replace him with Lord Mountbatten. And it was a very bizarre, people, the newspapers would be writing about this as if this is some serious event. I mean, because first of all, there was nothing really terrible going on in Britain in 1968 that would justify a coup. This would be a coup. When we look back at that on those days of the 1960s, in terms of prosperity, rising tide lifts all boats. That was a pretty good time in Great Britain. All the way up to about 1973. Those are good times in Britain. So there was nothing going on that would justify the overthrow of Harold Wilson's government. The other thing is also, how do you do that? How do you overthrow an elected government by somebody who is non-elected? What would Mountbatten's claims be as the sort of legitimate leader of Great Britain? Mountbatten, he enjoyed a certain reputation because, of course, the royal family, and he was related to Prince Philip and the Queen. But Mountbatten, his record was hardly particularly sterling. Mountbatten was really responsible for the complete debacle of the British withdrawal from India. That was, the horrific communal massacres that took place. Millions and millions of people were killed. That was a direct result of Mountbatten. Mountbatten had been the Viceroy of India, and the way he liquidated the British Empire was just shocking. So it's not as if Mountbatten had a particularly sterling reputation. So it was very strange for the Cecil King to plot this. You can plot to overthrow Harold Wilson within the Labour government. You could think about somebody within the cabinet who could replace Wilson as leader of the party and therefore become leader of the government. But it was just bizarre. First of all, Labour had a huge majority because Labour had won the election of 1966, and very, very, very comfortably. So Wilson was sitting on a big parliamentary majority, which again would say, what's the basis for overthrowing Wilson? It is true, though, that Wilson became very unpopular. There's no question. 68, 69, he was really underwater. Um, and and then people start speculating, well, he's doing so badly, maybe we should replace him. But that would only make sense if you replace him with somebody within the cabinet. And there were like the Times um, was urging the replacement of Wilson by, I think, George Brown. They wanted George Brown because he was he was on the right of the party, and he had a sort of rough and ready way about him. And so they said, okay, well, there was a famous editorial that the Times wrote, Wilson versus George Brown, and the line was in this editorial: better a George Brown drunk than a Harold Wilson sober, because George Brown was a notorious drunkard. I mean, he was always just absolutely hammered. But Time said, better a George Brown drunk than a Harold Wilson sober. So Wilson was very unpopular, and he was underwater in the polls. But it was by those standards. I mean, he's nothing like today's kind of Keir Starmer. But either way, as I say, I don't see how you could replace him. How you can remove an elected government by an unelected government. I mean, unless in very extreme circumstances. So it was complete nonsense. But there was absolutely, this went on. There was a lot of discussion, a lot of speculation about the Cecil King plot to replace Harold Wilson by Mountbatten. So your, Dale, your memory is absolutely correct. Anyway, thank you for that, Cynthia. It's always very good to see you, Cynthia. And I should remind you that Cynthia is a resident film expert, film scholar. She has an amazing encyclopedic knowledge of films and cinema history. She provides us regularly with these fascinating, detailed information about the films that we screen every week as part of the Gaggle Film Club. And you know, we screened The Sting yesterday, and as usual, Cynthia just provided us with an amazing amount of really fascinating information, a lot of very interesting insights. So I would urge everyone, look at the Sting. It's on our locals page, and then as you watch the film, read Cynthia's comments, or if you don't want to be distracted while you're watching the film, then save Cynthia's comments afterwards. So it's a real pleasure for us, and it's just I always learn so much because this is information that I certainly didn't know. I would though say that, just as on kind of sidetrack, we had the Sting, and I think a lot of people like the Sting. I was thinking that the Sting, when I watch films, often I change my mind. I saw a film many years ago, and then maybe I didn't like it very much then, and I see it now, and I say, I think I was wrong. I think that this film actually is a lot better than I thought originally, and vice versa. There are films that I saw that I liked years ago, and then I look at it now and I say, I think I was wrong. I think this is pretty lousy. The Sting has none of that. The Sting is, my response to the Sting that I watched last night. I haven't seen it for years and years. Is exactly the same as my response many years ago. I thought it was okay. I thought it was quite a fun, entertaining film years and years ago. I didn't think it was anything special years and years ago. And I watched it yesterday. I thought fun, entertaining, and there's nothing special about it. My view has remained exactly the same on this thing. It won a lot of Oscars. It was in 1973. I'm not sure why it won so many Oscars. I don't think it deserved so many Oscars, but I would assume that the reason it won the Oscars was that at that time, in 1973, 74, America was in a kind of really really kind of depressed and despondent, with Vietnam and Watergate and crime in the streets, and I think people wanted to watch a film that was uplifting. Hey, two charming, likable grifters take on a heavy guy, and they outwit him and cheat him out of his money. And it was a nice, uplifting story. And I think because of that, Hollywood showered this film with can't remember how many Oscars, but it really didn't really deserve them. So, but anyway, I still recommend people should watch the film, and above all, read Cynthia's comments, because they're really interesting and illuminating, and fascinating. Anyway, Cynthia says, even if the Epstein files prove that Epstein was a Mossad asset blackmailing Trump and other American bigwigs into doing Israel's bidding, none of that will be released, as it'll be deemed too damaging to the bond between the US and Israel to ever be declassified. So why is Trump having a meltdown over this, since nothing awfully incriminating about him will ever be exposed, unless it can somehow fully expose how utterly slavish he is to his Zionist paymasters? Not likely to happen, though. Well, I have to say, the premises, I think, are correct. That even if this was the case, we wouldn't find out about it. As I think I've said before, I've always been skeptical of that, the thesis that Epstein was working for Mossad. I just haven't seen evidence of that. Now, is it plausible that, given his amazingly diverse and distinguished group of friends that he maintained over many years, these are some of the most important people in the world, Larry Summers, Bill Gates, Yehud Barak. Just because they Woody Allen, they would all come to his house. It's quite plausible that various intelligence agencies, including Mossad, would approach him and ask him about some information about all these important people. That doesn't mean he was working for Mossad, but they may well approach him and want to know something. I have my doubts that if he was really working for Mossad, he would form such a close friendship with Noam Chomsky. I think that kind of would demonstrate to me that it's very unlikely he was working for Mossad. Chomsky would not be hanging out with him if he thought that he was working for the Israelis. And he was, at no point has Chomsky ever wavered on the subject of Israel. He's been a very firm, fervent critic of Israel, right into his, old age. And so, throughout the time he was with Epstein. So, I find the story of Mossad and Epstein, and I don't even know what exactly he would be doing, giving Mossad that he wouldn't be giving to other intelligence services. Yeah, I can imagine that FBI would approach him for information. I can imagine CIA would approach him for information, and MI5, MI6, they would all approach him for information, as well as Mossad. But I don't know what exactly he would do for Mossad that that would be particularly useful. What does Mossad do? It conducts assassinations, sometimes effectively, sometimes not terribly effectively. It has agents inside the government, and that makes sense. You want to know exactly what's going on inside the government, but Epstein wasn't really in the government. It's possible he was funneling money to Israel, but I don't know exactly how how he worked that. I mean, but it's possible. He was doing that. I haven't seen any evidence of that, but I don't rule it out that somehow that was part of his financial gift, that he knew he would know how to funnel money to Israel. But that's all. It seems to me it's all speculative. Now, why Trump is so indignant about this, I'm not exactly sure. Other than I think he may well feel that he's been unfairly maligned over Epstein, and there's some truth to that. I mean, I haven't seen any refutation of the story that he and Epstein had a falling out, or whatever the issue was. They had a falling out around 2004, and since 2004, he has had nothing to do with Epstein. So he may well feel, well, why I am Trump? I watch television. He watches television assiduously, and he watches all the news shows. He's constantly, and particularly by the Democrat politicians, they're all accusing him of some kind of link to Epstein. And I think that it's just infuriated him that he's like, well, why am I getting accused of connections with Epstein? I haven't had any dealings with him since 2004, while others, such as Larry Summers, and Bill Clinton, and all kinds of Democrats, with Alan Dershowitz and the rest, they continued associating with Epstein long after he had been convicted. I mean, in the case of Larry Summers, we've just found out the last message he sent to Epstein was, I think, a day before his arrest in 2019. So Larry Summers had maintained close relations with Epstein all the way up to his arrest in 2019, and then soon after that, his suicide. So you can see why Trump would say, well, why is everyone associating me with Epstein when I didn't have any dealings with him since 2004? And I actually had a falling out with him because everyone else just continued having relations with him. Again, like Noam Chomsky. I mean, Chomsky continued, having a very warm relationship with him. I can't remember up until what time. Maybe up until not long before his arrest in 2019. So I mean, so that's just speculation on my part. That is just he's acting kind of irrationally, like just out of anger that he's being unfairly maligned. It's possible. I mean, also, and this came out in the those 20,000 emails or messages or documents or whatever it was that the House Republicans released. That Epstein is I think filled with real resentment towards Trump. They'd been quite close friends, and then they had a falling out, and then Trump went on to bigger things. I mean, 2011, 2012, he thought Trump was going to run for the presidency, and then he did run for the presidency, and successfully. And you can see why, it's very human. Somebody you once were friends with, then you had a falling out with, and then that person really went on to bigger and bigger things, that you would feel a lot of resentment towards that person. And he may well have sent all kinds of very nasty messages about Trump to many people. He, may have just, as we've already found this out, when he was corresponding with this Stacey Plaskett, while Michael Cohen was testifying before her committee, he was kind of feeding her questions. You could see also in his discussions with Michael Wolff, they were figuring out, how do we stop Trump? How do we hurt Trump? So Trump may just be afraid that Epstein, there are messages there in which Epstein is really dishing the dirt on Trump, just saying things that, Trump can say, oh, well, that's untrue. That's what he's saying about me is untrue. But, when people if people want to believe something negative about you, they'll believe something negative. So there'll maybe just be a lot of messages there that reflect badly on Trump. They may well be not true, but people will still believe them to be true. So that may be a reason why he's resisted. I mean, I think that he probably does feel, hey, why am I getting stuck with this? Why of all people, I am the one who's getting blamed for Epstein, and particularly when it was his Justice Department, Trump's Justice Department in 2019, that actually launched the prosecution of Epstein. I mean, he was arrested pursuant to the Trump DOJ's renewed investigation. That's why. So I think he does feel a kind of resentment. Why am I now associated with Epstein? Whereas everybody else can just simply, everyone's forgotten about Bill Clinton's association with him. He went on being friends with him long after his conviction in Florida. So I think those are the two reasons why I think that Trump has been stonewalling. But it's been very foolish politically. I mean, obviously, it's hurt him a lot and it always looks, if you're standing in the way of disclosure, then it always looks like, well, you've got something to hide. I mean, there's just no way around it. Yeah, that you're against disclosure because you have something to hide. The media are running with it, with that the line. He's obviously hiding something, and Trump is onto hiding to nothing. I mean, yeah, it looks like you're trying to hide something, but I doubt whether there's very much. I may be wrong, but I don't think there's anything. I haven't seen any evidence that he and Epstein maintain any kind of relationships afterwards. And I don't think Trump has ever really been particularly interested in underage girls. I think it's never been his thing. I mean, the thing is having classy European women. I mean, that's that I think that's his fetish. Underage girls has never been his fetish. So, but he has a soft spot for the classy European women. Ann Coulter once wrote that Trump's problem, Ann Coulter was kind of very unkind, but they said that what Trump's problem is his very heavy New York accent. He can't get rid of that very heavy New York accent. And that prevented him from marrying a classy American woman, which I think was his real dream. Some to marry a waspy American woman, but they would never be able to get past his thick New York accent. So the only thing he could do is to marry a classy European, and because they wouldn't really understand that's a low class accent that Trump has. I don't know, that's true, but it's a little like with British accents. Unless you know British accents, you really don't know what a low class British accent is from an upper class British accent. That's why people get confused and they think, oh, he's got a lovely accent. And then you have to tell them, do you realize that is a really low class accent? But unless you live in Britain and you have a feel for those accents, you just wouldn't know. And to an outsider, all British accents sound wonderful. But so I think maybe like there's something to that. Yeah, that New York accent has always been a kind of an inhibiting factor for him. Anyway, Cynthia then goes on, but If by chance Trump is ever exposed for being blackmailed into doing Israel's bidding, it'd have to be done by a whistleblowing state actor, which is not at all likely as well. Yet, what about non state actors like the whistleblower hacker site Distributed Denial of Secrets? Haven't they gathered enough dirt on Trump from the Epstein file, irrefutably proving that Epstein blackmailed him into always putting Israel's interests above over the interests of the U.S.? Well, that's an interesting question. The if Trump were being blackmailed, I would think that the blackmailers, or to put Israel's interests above those of the United States, those would be people with money. I mean, they are the people who would be able to wield power over Trump. Like the Adelsons. Husband and wife, the Adelsons. There's a lot of money splashing around. Israel is a money receiving organization. I mean, Israel doesn't have any money to give. Israel receives money. Israel has always got its hand out and wants money from others. And Israel blackmails others and extorts money from others for its ends. It's not like the Adelsons. The Adelsons have money, and the Adelsons help fund Israel. The thing about Israel is that the people acting on behalf of Israel, they have to spend a lot of money to buy politicians. They have to buy them because otherwise, politicians would start thinking, why are we putting his interest above those of our own national interests? So that's how Israel. It's a constant need on Israel's part to buy politicians, to buy them and buy them and buy them, because otherwise they might think, hey, why are we putting the interests of this tiny country with 9 million above those of the United States? So, they could, it's possible they could blackmail, but usually they're just, people acting on behalf of Israel. AIPAC gathers money from Americans. That isn't money from Israel. It's money from rich Zionist Jews in the United States. That's where money from AIPAC goes. Now, it's possible Israel has some dirt on Trump. The problem that I have with that thesis is that Trump has been around for an awful long time. I mean, and he's been under scrutiny for an awfully long time, and I can't imagine what you could come up with now on Trump that would be so damaging that it would just be it would destroy his career. If there had been, and that's why I think there isn't any. If there had been, the Democrats would absolutely have used that information during the Biden years. So they had the Epstein files. That's the moment when you really can use whatever you've got and destroy Trump. Anything that's is damaging. But they didn't. Instead, they came up with these convoluted legal cases. I mean, the nonsense in New York. Two nonsense: the civil case in New York, the criminal case in New York. The Jack Smith's case about that somehow he had under the Espionage Act. I mean, this was absolute nonsense. If you had something really damaging on him, some some case involving, I don't know, an 8-year-old. The Democrats knew, boom, you get that out there, and Trump is sunk. I don't think there is that. I think that basically that information doesn't really exist. Because if it had, I think the Democrats would have used it. They were desperate to stop Trump from 2021 through to 2024, and I'm sure that they looked through the Epstein files and just didn't find anything. Because if they had found anything, they would absolutely have leaked this material. So, I don't say now. Unfortunately, Trump, like many others, has indeed put Israel's interests above those of the United States. He's been doing that. And he promised he wouldn't do so. But if you ask, well, why has he done that? I don't think you necessarily have to look for some nefarious motive. He's part of the the political establishment. It's very, the political establishment has been putting Israel's interests above those of the United States. I mean, they've been doing this for years. Trump is a part of it. It's the same with, well, why has he done what he done on Russia and Ukraine? He said he wouldn't. Well, because he's part of the same system. He wades in the same dirty pool as all other American politicians. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And then Robert, thanks. Good to see you again, Robert. Thank you so much, Robert, always for your generosity. And Robert says, wasn't it Gloria Allred who pioneered the use of the term survivor in order to boost moral outrage and thereby civil damages? I didn't know that it was she. She was the one who coined it. I mean, it wouldn't at all surprise me. She's one of the sleaziest, most awful kind of ambulance chasing lawyers, and she's been doing this whole victim thing for years and years. Got very rich, and by doing so, and it's a very, very, very cute way of going about things, by presenting these women, her clients invariably these women, they're survivors, they're all victims, and then everybody gets so intimidated by this, and then they say, oh well, it's, the victims, survivors, and they don't even ask the most obvious questions, such as, well, how old were you when you came into Jeffrey Epstein's orbit? I mean, so they know it's a very because that's the height of bad manners. Well, if you're in your 20s, you can't really present yourself as a victim. But you're absolutely right. It's all about squeezing as much money as you can. Now, the amazing thing is that nobody ever questions. I mean, you can imagine how dumb or naive or whatever you want to call it, how people are in just simply accepting that the stories that these women are peddling are true. There's a lot of money at stake. They're essentially, and many of these women have already been paid a lot of money. There have been so many different settlements from the Epstein estate, so many of them have become very, very rich. In a way, they hit the jackpot. They were hoping to hit the jackpot when they moved into Epstein's orbit in the 1980s and 90s, because he was, a rich, wealthy New Yorker, owned the biggest townhouse in New York. And what do you know? Ambitious young women would congregate around somebody like that, with such a, owner of such a big house, and with so many distinguished friends, and would have nice parties, and parties on his island in the Caribbean. Of course, young women would be drawn to that. That's what they do. And so then they got some things. They obviously didn't get everything that they wanted, and then hey, there's a payday. You say, oh, well, there's money to be had. I mean, this happens all the time. The moment there's the possibility of some global settlement, just how many tens, thousands and thousands of people suddenly come out of the woodwork and say, yeah, 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 happened to me. Yeah, yeah, happened to me, because you want to be part of the global settlement. And so this whole thing that you presented in this way, that these are somehow survivors, and heaven forbid that anybody should ask, well, how old were you when you met Epstein? What did Epstein do to you that was so terrible? And of course, none of them can even spell out what did he do that was so terrible. Hey, you went to his house, you hung around in his house, and you met all sorts of important people at his house. Oh, I was being groomed. Groomed for what? Epstein, he wasn't really that into sex. I mean, he was, he had this particular thing of his, which was these massages. I mean, I know he liked these massages from very, very young girls. That was his thing. But most of the women who hung around him, they didn't have any sexual relations with Epstein. I mean, I'm not defending him. I'm not saying he was obviously a pretty ghastly character, but I'm just saying that you kind of have to be a little bit, um, a little bit more circumspect when you discuss him. I mean, like when Megyn Kelly said recently, well, he's not really a pedophile, and actually everyone attacked Megyn Kelly, but Megyn Kelly was saying something that's correct. He's not a pedophile. I mean, whatever you could say, these are, very, maybe could well be that some of these young women were underage by Florida law standards, not underage by European standards. We talked about this before. Age of consent in many European countries is 14, in other countries it's 15. Florida it was actually I think it was 18 in Florida. So yeah, I mean it had a very high age of consent, but in many countries, these young women would have been above the age of consent. That's still very sleazy. Not one doesn't have to. I think absolutely he was a very sleazy character. But to talk in terms of victims and and survivors. I mean, the moment you use a word like survivor, I mean, what do people think about? Oh, the Holocaust. Well, that of course itself is a racket. I mean, the whole survivors thing is just has been a racket for some time. But then adopting this kind of language, and why? And I mean, Robert, you put your finger on it. Why? Because it increases civil damages. It so intimidates courts, juries, judges. When you talk about survivors, then hey, what do you do with survivors? You give them as much as you can, and of course, Gloria Allred, she gets a third of everything. That's very nice. You got a third of these whacking great settlements. You've got a few $1 million. You got a third of that. That's some serious change that Gloria Allred is making. So anyway, thank you so much, Robert. Anne Marie, it was always good to see you. Thank you so much, Anne Marie. As always, for your generosity. Anne Marie, as I always say, is a resident, musical expert and a very distinguished musical performer. Played in all the best orchestras in the world, worked with the most distinguished musicians of the 20th and 21st century, and she invariably provides us with very illuminating insights into the music that we post here. So, she's just written about the Kurt Weill, the Threepenny music that we posted a week ago. Really, really interesting. And she talked about her working on the rise and fall of the city of Mahogany, which I have seen. And she has some very really interesting things to say about the rise and fall of the city of Mahogany. And she posted some pictures from the performance that she was involved in, which is really really interesting. So I strongly urge everyone, to go to the Gaggle and look up her comments. And of course, she also said some very interesting things recently about Sibelius's Third Symphony. Very, very interesting, very stimulating, and I intend to address her comments. I'm really looking forward to doing that. But as I say, I mean, Anne Marie is a very knowledgeable, uh, musical expert, and she knows music from inside out. If you're a performer, you have a very, very different outlook on music, from somebody like me who's an outsider, and therefore I always learn so much more about music from somebody from the inside, somebody who knows about musical performance. So thank you so much, Anne Marie. I really appreciate it. And as I say, I will address your comments on Sibelius shortly. Um, and then Summer Petros says, thank you so much, Summer Petros. Was a friend of mine. He was in Hungary recently. He's a fluent Hungarian speaker. There are many of those in the world, so we always have to hold him in some awe. Absolutely. No, he can, somebody who can speak effortlessly in Hungarian. That's something. Anyway, Summer Petros says Harold Wilson, as president of the Board of Trade in the 1950s, and he was president. In fact, earlier than that, he was elected to Parliament in 1945, the big Labour landslide, and he was immediately appointed president of the Board of Trade. So, and in fact, I mean, it's not even the 1950s, because he resigned as I can't remember exactly the year that he resigned the position, but I think it was. I mean, the Labour government fell in 1951. So, see, he resigned sometime before that, because Wilson was a follower of Aneurin Bevan, and Bevan was the leader. It was the kind of the leader of the Labour left. So everyone who was on the Labour left idolized Aneurin Bevan. And like Michael Foot, we talked about him, completely hapless figure, but he was a huge, adorer of Aneurin Bevan, and he wrote a massive, I think it was a 2-volume biography of Aneurin Bevan. So Bevan resigned from the Attlee government, and then Bevan's supporters, which included Harold Wilson, also resigned from that government. Anyway, Wilson was the president of the Board of Trade, and indeed before the wartime coalition, I think he went on many trips to Moscow, but that was his job. Yes, that's right. I mean, he one has to keep in mind that those years were the years of the Grand Alliance with the Soviet Union, and so in that spirit, it would make sense you would go to Moscow to do trade deals. Was he doing that during the Cold War? Because Clement Attlee was as stalwart a Cold warrior as you can imagine. I mean, the Truman administration had no problems with Attlee, and the Attlee's foreign secretary was Ernie Bevin. Ernie Bevin was a famous trade unionist. He had been many years a trade unionist. He absolutely loathed the communists and hated the communists. So as some of those trade unionists were, they were more passionately anti-communist than anyone else. So Ernie Bevin was very anti-communist, and very anti-Soviet. And so the Attlee government was indeed very anti-Soviet. So I don't know whether Wilson was making trips as president of the Board of Trade during the Cold War. I mean, things, of course, changed after Stalin's death, but the late 1940s were among the most acute of the acute of the years of the Cold War. So I don't know whether Wilson was making trips then, but I think he without question, he had people around him, and that I think aroused the suspicion of MI5. Some of the people around him did have extensive business interests in the Soviet Union. I can't remember the name of the guy. Was it Kagan? I think Lord Kagan, who was, there were members of his kind of kitchen cabinet, and they did have extensive business ties. But not Wilson himself. But yeah, but I think that was him, Kagan, who did have business ties in the Soviet Union. Anyway, thank you, Summer Petros. And then Marty, I see here, he's posted a picture of Trump, yes, it's thick and thin, Trump and and Stub golfing together. So that's helped elevate Finland, a very small country, very very small country, but it's but suddenly there he is. Great pals with the President of the United States, bonding over golf. Thank you for that picture. And Robert says, Ken Burns has a new documentary on the American Revolution. Yeah, I read about it. I haven't watched it yet, but I've read about that. His films are always well crafted and compelling. They are. I just can't stand him. There's just something. I don't know. His whole persona is so repellent. So I'm always surprised that these documentaries are generally pretty good, but there's a lot of tendentiousness. I mean, you don't get to be doing documentaries for PBS without being very tendentious. So you can always expect everything that's politically correct from Burns, even though the documentaries are pretty interesting, but it's the political correctness is a little tedious. Anyway, Ken Burns is a new documentary on the American Revolution. His films are always well crafted and compelling, but they often elevate the role of the state. Is it too harsh to suggest his formula to set Hegel's idea that the state is humanity's grandest achievement to Appalachian fiddle music? I think that's a good point. It's a very interesting notion. I mean, what was Hegel's idea of? Hegel admired the state because he admired the principle of the rule of law. So it was a part of his philosophy that you have the individual, and then you have the civil society, and above all of it is the state. But Hegel didn't really want the state to be particularly oppressive. That wasn't his thing. I mean, I think he liked the state because it embodied the idea of the rule of law, and there couldn't be civil society without the rule of law, and there couldn't be individual freedom without the rule of law. So everything was somehow guaranteed by the state. I think that was really his philosophy. So it wasn't really advocating statism, but it was just part of his philosophy that the rule of law comes above everything else. I would imagine in the case of Burns, because he has the usual fashionable liberal ideas, I mean, I think he admires the state as a force that intervenes in society, because somehow civil society in America is tainted by racism, by sexism, misogyny, ignorant white folk, and somehow there's a need for state intervention to rectify social ills, because if you don't, then really terrible things happen. So I think his model of state is essentially that the intervention by the state in the 1950s and 60s to promote civil rights. Because if the state didn't do that, then essentially there'd be no civil rights in America. And I think that's his perspective. I think it's a very oversimplified, but I think he has a kind of a sort of the 1960s liberal outlook about him. Anyway, thank you so much, Robert. And Richard Phillips says, "What infuriates means the way they treat everyone like we are complete idiots." Yeah. They expect to believe a country with no motive did something that doesn't benefit them. Oh, we're talking about Russia, yeah. But the country does benefit, didn't do it. Yeah, yes, it's a very good point. Yeah, absolutely. Like cui bono, all these attacks, these so-called attacks, all the railway line, the drones, explosions here, firebombing or whatever. And supposedly it helps Russia. And you think, well, it doesn't help Russia at all. I mean, how does any of that help Russia? Whom does it help? Well, it helps the warmongers, because every time there's anything like this, they seize on it in order to whip up war fever. So you're absolutely right. If you ask cui bono, well, it benefits Tusk. Tusk has nothing else to say about anything other than promoting war against Russia. That's all he does. Prime Minister of Poland, who's got nothing else on his mind other than how do we get a war with Russia? And so something like this happens, he rushes to the scene. We saw already all the footage from yesterday. He was there inspecting the railway lines. Yeah, whom does it benefit? It benefits Tusk and Sikorsky. And then Richard Phillips goes on. I think they use terrorists because people assume terrorists are kind of irrational. Well, locals not allowing me to add tip. Why doesn't it? Other people manage to tip, but anyway. But it should be allowed to tip because as I see others are tipping anyway. But Stone Ruby, I think you did tip. I saw that your tip has been recorded. So. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody. I think my time has expired. Thank you, everybody who joined me. Somebody says, is George radically sane or merely pseudo-sane? Well, that's an interesting philosophical question. That's something to think about tonight here, in this dark, gloomy Budapest. I'll be thinking about, am I radically sane or only pseudo-sane? Yeah, well, that's you can talk about among yourselves and decide on that question. Anyway, thank you everybody who joined me. Thank you so much for all your really interesting questions and observations, and really very interesting. And above all, thank you so much to all who contributed something to the tip jar. It helps us do what we do here. The dogs, they're not going to say anything. They're always disgruntled, always dissatisfied, and they take out their frustration, of course, on me. But I thank everybody who contributed to the tip jar. Really appreciate that. Cynthia says, the picture you painted in my head had me in stitches. Okay. I don't know. All right. That's a good thing, I think. All right. Thank you so much. We'll be back on Thursday, same time. And I look forward to seeing everybody then. Until then, all the best. Goodbye. Good night. See you Thursday. Bye-bye.